The storm in today's gospel, of course, has me thinking of my identity as being a Kansan. We Kansans are no strangers to storms. I think I could make a pretty safe bet that nearly everyone here today has at least one great storm story. Lifelong Kansans probably have a whole anthology of them. I know I do. When I think of my personal history, I've often structured it around great storms. The big flood in '93, in which my sisters and I were evacuated from our home by boat. We live nowhere near any body of water. There were the terrible ice storms, in which breaking trees sounded like gunshots, or the 2011 tornado that wiped out a sizable portion of Joplin, Missouri, just southeast of my home. They aren't all tragedies, or at least not only tragic. We often tell stories like this with a certain degree of awe, equal parts frightened and amazed by the power of weather and nature. I would also guess that I'm not alone in my appreciation of watching an intense Kansas thunderstorm work its way across the sky. Among all my storm stories, however, I've never experienced a storm at sea. And I have to say, they sound positively terrifying. Even a very small body of water can be deadly dangerous when the weather shifts. The Sea of Galilee is actually a lake rather than a true sea, roughly 13 miles long, 8 miles wide. Compared to the 118-mile wide Lake Michigan, it sounds pretty tame, but due to its location, in the very northern end of the Jordan Rift Valley, the sea exists in a kind of microclimate in which severe storms can whip up quite quickly and with very little warning. So this is our setting for the gospel story today. It's the first scene of Jesus crossing the sea in the Gospel of Mark. The second sea crossing comes in chapter 6, with Jesus walking across the water to join the disciples already in the boat. We won't cover that this year, but it's good to keep in mind. Both times, Jesus is crossing into Gentile territory with his disciples, and great storms arise. This first scene of Jesus in the storm comes fairly early in Mark's gospel, and I think that's key. It's important that Mark is trying to establish his Christology, understanding who Jesus is, telling the story of his gradually revealing identity and his lordship. In telling this story, Mark describes Jesus' kingship through this act of power over creation. He's doing things that are reserved for God, for the Creator. He's sharing in that same power of bringing order to chaos. This is a chaotic experience for the disciples. They are crossing the sea, as they have probably done hundreds of times before, and a storm whips up. It becomes worse and worse. It's becoming terrifying. It gets so bad that they truly believe they're about to perish. And their teacher is asleep in the stern, on a cushion. I imagine they ask him, as they wake him, they ask him with a certain note of frustration in their voices. "Teacher, do you not even care that we are perishing? Jesus, this is serious." And so he wakes and rebukes the storm. And I hate to say, I hear something of an echo of the rebuke in his response to the disciples. "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" But this was a properly fearful experience. The storm is frightening. Crossing into the unknown is frightening. You don't have to be an experienced fisherman to know that being in a boat as it is filling with water in a terrible storm is a frightening experience. But Jesus, in the middle of this terrible storm, Jesus' response is to ask why they are afraid. I imagine myself in the place of the disciples, and it stings a bit to hear that. I find it easy to identify with the disciples whenever they are confused or hurt or don't understand what Jesus has told them. And so I feel that sting. The danger is real, or it was, just a moment ago. Just a moment ago, the wind was beating their ship into the sea. Waves were crashing over them and swamping the boat to the point where they believed they would drown. It made sense to be afraid a moment ago. But the lacking element, as Jesus points out, is their faith. Perhaps it's because this event comes fairly early in the gospel narrative. They do not yet understand. They don't fully trust yet. Their faith is still so young. They're still learning just who it is that they have in the boat with them. Have you no faith? Perhaps not no faith, but not enough. All the disciples have at this point is awe and wonder and fear. A little later in the story, in the second sea crossing, maybe after coming to know Jesus just a little bit better, they do make a bolder statement of belief and faith. But it's still not enough. And not to jump too far ahead, but even at Jesus' death and resurrection, Mark's depiction of those closest followers is still one of astonishment, fear, wonder. Discipleship and faith take time to develop, to strengthen to the point of deep trust. It's not something that can be turned on like flipping a switch, not even after witnessing a miracle. They are just coming to know this strange teacher. This teacher who they are following is turning all their expectations upside down. In the midst of scarcity, Jesus gives life and feeds 5,000. In the midst of calamity, he calms the sea and gives peace. Over and over, he reverses the disciples' expectations to a degree that shakes the very core of their understanding of what it means to be. We hear the echoes of this reversal in Paul's letter to the Corinthians. We are treated as impostors and yet are true. We are sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. As having nothing and yet possessing everything. As dying, and see, we are alive. What the world defines as calamity and death and the end, Jesus contradicts. Illogically, it seems often, he tells them, don't be afraid. Face all these things, but leave your fear behind. How are we to do this? It is with the company of the one who promises that he is with us. It's reasonable to be afraid in the storm. But with me, their teacher tells them, you do not have to be afraid. It may be a very slight distinction, but I do appreciate that Jesus doesn't tell the disciples that there's nothing to be afraid of. Because sometimes fearsome things are very real. The storms of our lives may threaten us greatly, but they do not have the final power to overwhelm us. Jesus tells us, do not be afraid, not because there's nothing worth our fear, but because he is with us, and it makes all the difference. He is present with us through all the dangerous upheaval and storms of our lives. It is the very Son of God in the boat with us. There is, in the story, a great storm. Jesus grants then a great calm. And the response? Great fear. Even witnessing this miracle, the disciples are not less fearful after the great calm. But it is perhaps a different fear, maybe one that is changing. Their great fear has become great awe in our translation today, in part because our definitions of the words have shifted. But I think the closeness of these words to one another is significant. The fear moving to awe is, I think, where lies the growth of faith. We will be afraid. Going from the known into the unknown, whenever we are experiencing something that's beyond our understanding, this can spark feelings of fear and awe. Even in moments of great joy, great beauty, we can be nearly overwhelmed. I don't know about you, but I often can't quite tell the difference between tears of mourning and tears of joy. They often blend together. Genuine encounters with God, with the vastness, the infinite abundance, the truly limitless love, they can sometimes be almost too much to bear. When we are called beyond our current understanding, we still have those feelings of fear and awe because it calls us into a place of vulnerability. But again, this is the birthplace of faith. This is the space, uncomfortable and unsteady, where our fledgling faith can grow, where we can be assured that through all the storms of our lives, all the fears that we face, we at least will never face them alone. This faith, even the strongest faith, does not eliminate our fear, nor the storms that we will face, but rather it is the ship that will carry us through them. Even amidst our lack of faith and our fears, Jesus calms the storm. Before he asks them why they're afraid and if they have faith, he rebukes the wind and calms the waters. God's powerful word of peace is still the final word, spoken amidst the chaos of the world and our lives. As Harvard chaplain Mark Eddington writes, Jesus rebukes that which threatens life. His word to the storm does not overpower, but gives what it calls for: peace. My prayer for us today is that we would know this peace, that we would remember it in the midst of our storms, and that we would turn to one another in this community of faith to remember that we are not alone in the boat.